Hello, hello, everyone. Letting folks trickle in. Welcome. As you join the webinar, feel free to put your name, pronouns, and just maybe something delicious you ate recently. We're going to wait a minute or two to get more folks in, and then we're going to get started. All right. Okay. Oh, all right, folks. Let's get started. We have quite a few people already here, and we have a lot to dig into. So I'll just kick us off with a welcome. Welcome to Risky Business, moving from fear to bravery to create a just society. I'm Allison. I'm the VP of Brand and Storytelling at Common Future. And for those of you who are new to Common Future, we're a national organization that powers community-driven solutions that advance racial and economic equity. And this conversation is really one of many we're going to be having around risk, particularly redefining risk. I think our concepts of risk can, yes, they underpin our decisions, but they can actually sometimes undermine our attempts at justice. So this is one of many conversations we're having about reframing, rethinking, and getting to root causes of not just how we think, but inequity, um, both in these conversations and others. So today is more of a casual conversation. I'm going to hand it off to the folks you're here to see in a second, but we're really trying to create a space to examine and confront risk, and also just be honest that sometimes deciding what move to make, what strategy to move into can be really challenging, not because of resources or anything like that, but because maybe you're not sure what will happen. And so I'm really excited to hand this over to our panelists. And we have 90 minutes together, but we really want to have a conversation. So we invite you all in. Please use the Q&A feature. We'll get to Q&A right after the conversation, but you can also just add it any time and even chime in the chat if you so desire. But yes, this is supposed to be just an open and an inviting conversation. I know I asked y'all to share your name, pronouns, and something great you ate, but one other thing I invite y'all to do is to actually chew on these two questions. What comes to mind when you think about risk? And what comes to mind when you think about organizational risk, right? So we're going to look at it both from an organizational perspective, but also an individual perspective. So all that being said, I'm going to kick it off to the both of you, Jennifer, our co-CEO Common Future, and Vule from Nonprofit AF. I'll let y'all take it from here.
Thank you so much, Allison. Good morning, everyone. Hey, Jennifer. How's it going?
Hey, good. How are you?
Good. For everyone out there, I'm Vu. I use he, him pronouns, and I am from Seattle, which is on Duwamish and Coast Salish land. Although right now I'm in Whistler, BC, Canada, in a hotel room right now, right, where it's rainy. And yeah. Also, for colleagues who are blind or have low vision, I'm a mid-aged Asian man with short black hair and glasses right now. Over to you, Jennifer.
Yes. Good morning. Good afternoon, everyone. So good to see you. So glad to be here. My name is Jennifer Chuguna. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. And I am calling in from West Orange, New Jersey, also known as the land of the Lenape. I am a Black woman. I am wearing a bright yellow shirt and I am wearing glasses.
Awesome. Maybe we can stay off mute for the whole conversation. Is that okay? Okay, great. Yeah. So thanks so much, everyone, for joining us. Jennifer, it seems like a lot of people are maybe familiar with some of the work that I've been doing, which is to rant about stuff, but they may not be as familiar with your work. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself and the work that you do at Common Future?
Yes, happy to. So again, I'm a co-CEO at Common Future, and Common Future is really focusing on advancing racial and economic equity. We do that by partnering with community-rooted organizations and really investing in and uplifting their ideas and solutions on how to create an equitable economy. We know for sure that our economy is broken and has not worked for many communities, but we also know that solutions are here. They've been practiced for decades, for centuries, and so our work is really around normalizing those solutions and getting investments to them, particularly when they're led by Black and Indigenous and other communities. We also work to not just invest in those solutions, but really norm them and mainstream them by uplifting the insights and sharing those insights with other power holders. That might include philanthropy, banking, investors, policy leaders, et cetera. So that's our work in a nutshell. And then for me, I actually came into Common Future about 3.5 years ago. I started as the chief operating officer, and we moved into a shared leadership model about a year and a week ago. Prior to my time at Common Future, I've spent a lot of years in the nonprofit space at a variety of different types of organizations, from advocacy to consulting to direct services. I'm also a lawyer, so I've had both legal and non-legal roles, which also inform some of my approach to this conversation today. And just to give a little bit of background on myself, I'm originally from Oakland, California, and I've just long been passionate about, partnering with communities that reminded me of the one that I grew up in Oakland, California. So that's ultimately what has brought me to, the work of racial and economic justice.
Awesome. And I'm glad that you're a lawyer, because we have a bunch of legal things that we need to discuss. And I'm very confused by some of it. So I think it's very, very helpful. By the way, I also tried to become a lawyer, and I did not do. And it was like, this is horrible. I don't ever want to deal with this. This is like, I've never been able to complete a Sudoku puzzle in my entire life. And a lot of the questions are like, whoa. Yeah.
Yeah, I can understand that. I know for me, I questioned my decision a number of times once I actually got to law school. So that is very fair.
So let's talk about why we decided to have this webinar, right? I think you reached out a while ago, and somehow we decided that this would be a good topic for us to discuss. What happened? What were we thinking? I don't remember.
Yeah. I'm like, what didn't happen? There's a few things, and I'll just share a little bit of our friendship too. I remember when I first joined Common Future, I had actually reached out to you to join our team and do a session on scarcity mindset in nonprofits, right? And so it's really this idea that we make decisions from a place of scarcity. There's some assumptions about, the worst things that can happen, and it just really drives how we show up. And so for me, I regularly, think about those kinds of things and how they're informing decisions. And so when I think about where we are today, it's a very precarious time. And I say that lightly because it somehow seems to always feel that way. Just, what flavor of the day are we talking about? But, when I reflect on the past few years, the pandemic, the racial justice reckoning, wars, like just the various things that are happening, we're in a space where, we really need to be thinking about the risks that we have to take as a sector in order to continue doing the work that we do and showing up in the ways that we need to create a just society. And so in order for us to really do that and get there, it means we actually have to think about this idea, this concept of risk, because it is the thing that can, either allow us to make the best decisions and propel forward, or it's the thing that can really hinder us and, keep us locked in our steps and locked into a status quo, which is, not only a society that is unjust, but, continuing to get worse. And so I know that you have talked about a lot of these concepts often in your work, and you regularly, challenge us all in the sector and you say the things that need to be said and that a lot of other folks are afraid to say. And so it felt like a perfect way for us to just really grapple with these concepts, unpack them a bit more, and give some space to that. I know we're often very busy in our day to day, so we don't even take the time to, think about some of the assumptions and how we're showing up. So this felt like an incredible opportunity to do that. So I'm really excited. I mentioned how I'm showing up professionally to this conversation. But something else to mention too, I'm also a Virgo, so I feel like I'm regularly thinking about different kinds of risks and having a plan B and all those kinds of things. So it's also just part of my personality in that way. Maybe that's the thing that took me to law school. I don't know.
Well, awesome. And I'm getting a little bit of feedback that I am cutting out a little bit when I'm speaking. Is that
Just a little bit.
so?
I
My
can.
apologies. Yeah, let me know if it gets way too much because I'm in a hotel room in Canada right now. So I will try to keep that in mind. Oh, shoot. Uh, yeah, hold on a second. I need to move a little bit to the Wi-Fi is good. Um, okay, well, okay, the signal seems to be stronger now. So let's talk about the scarcity mindset. Why do we have this? Because this is something I've been talking about a lot, which is that we have this scarcity mindset that is naturally very risk averse in our sector. We're terrified of
Mhm.
losing funding. We're terrified of, like offending people. We are a group of full of like people who are not very conflict towards, like we're conflict avoidant. And can you tell us about why that is? Why are we this way, Jennifer?
Yes, yes. Thankfully, your calls about this have not fallen on, um, you know, times where we're not able to hear that. So I think it's really about how we are set up as a sector, right? We are overly reliant on the whims of funders and the directions that they want to take us in, which are not always aligned with the goals that help us truly advance a just society, even when they think they're doing so. We also have the IRS and tax laws, which have certain rules for us to follow. And a lot of the time, we're not well informed about that. And so it serves as another potential, barrier that gets in our way. Many of our organizations are strapped for funding, right? You talk about this a lot in terms of the various things that funders require that really detract from our work, not just through nonprofit AF, but crappy funding practices as well. So I think there's really something about how our sector is set up that prohibits us from wanting to take risks, from wanting to kind of shake things up, from wanting to put ourselves out there, let alone our organizations out there, right? Like when we talk about these are actually, people's jobs and livelihoods as well. So there's a lot, I think, to contend with. And it's been a norm for so long that even when we have the best intentions, we get into our various organizations and it's part of the culture. And we adapt and we adopt in various ways. And so when you look at the aggregate, we end up just contributing to this norm of how a variety of us operate. I mentioned the different types of organizations I've served in. And so I've seen it and I actively have to, do the work to think about whether and how I'm contributing to that and how I might do something different. So I think it's just part of the norm and the practices and has been that way for so long. And then, when we have seen examples of folks try to do something differently and sometimes it's okay, but not all the time. And we can get into that more about, what some of the actual risks are, but I think it's just been part of our culture for so long and how we're set up, how we're funded, how the laws work. And here we are.
Well, I'm hoping that we can get into a little bit later when we talk about, like, yeah, we say that this is how we are, this is how the laws are, but the reality is that it's not always that way. Certain people, for example, conservative movements, they're very risky, and they're very accepting of risk. Whereas it seems like progressive funders, movements, organizations are the ones who are always terrified of everything. And I talk to legal people, like general counsels and so on, and they're like, the progressive leaning ones are always, we got to mitigate risk. We can't get sued. We can't lose our funding. We can't be in the crosshairs of right wing pundits or whatever. Whereas the legal team on conservative movements are like, oh no, we're just gonna go forward, and if anyone sues us, we're gonna sue them right back. We're going to destroy their career. We're gonna do whatever it takes. And there seems to be a major difference. And I'm hoping we can get into that a little bit, because right now that seems to be what I'm noticing, is that like like lawsuits are always against people doing DEI work,
Mhm.
not the opposite. Like, we're not the ones going out there suing people who are preventing DEI from happening. So yeah, your thoughts before we launch into these
Yeah.
deeper conversations.
Yeah, totally. So I think there's a few things that come up for me when I think about that. I think conservative movements, number one, are much more coordinated and aligned on, say the top things that they want to advance. And so they center a lot of their work around that, and it makes for more effective coordination. That's not happening in the progressive space. I think the other thing about conservative movements is, they have these major funders that are also aligned and behind some of these things. And so, when they're able to get that kind of funding, it means they can move differently in the space. It means they can launch, a multi-pronged strategy for what they're going to do, including the lawsuits, including, establishing different organizations to, center around a particular issue, to do the narrative piece. I also think they're, doing a lot there in terms of the narratives. Even though they're terrible narratives, they are doing a lot to advance the kind of stories that are taking hold in various communities. And so also creating a groundswell of people that maybe are not in those groups, but that are helping to support and uplift those narratives. I think on the progressive side, not only do we not have the alignment, and there's a lot of variation in what we're trying to do, you also have folks that are afraid of the negative publicity, whereas conservative groups in some ways embrace it. And that negative publicity could be the media. It also could be the lawsuits. And I've also talked to people about the fact that, like, organizations get sued. Like, that's why there's lawyers, that's why there's insurance. So it's not just the notion of being sued that we should be afraid of. We should really understand the merits, because sometimes it's worth it to move forward, with the lawsuit, which we see the conservative groups do. But, on progressive side, it's like, how do we avoid the lawsuit altogether and not even go down that path? So I think you're exactly right. There's like some fundamental differences just in approach, and willingness to move forward and embrace certain things in terms of what I've seen.
Well, why don't we just go ahead and dive into this? Because I think this is something that's been on everyone's mind: the Fearless Fund, the Supreme Court's decision, and everything that's been happening around that and what it means for our sector. So, can you, as someone who has legal experience, talk a little bit more about what is the Fearless Fund? What is happening? Because we keep hearing about this. And what does this mean for our sector?
Yes. So the Fearless Fund, they're actually a cluster of a few different entities. And essentially, they're working on investing in seed and pre-seed and Series A capital for women of color-led businesses. They are responding to the inequity in our society. And, one of the major headlines that they, continue to highlight for us is the fact that, Black women in particular receive less than 1% of venture capital funding, right? That's horrific. And so their organization is responding to that. And so they had a grant program, the Strivers Grant, and it was providing $20,000 in grant funding to Black women-led firms. So they've been doing that work, you know, incorporated in Atlanta, working with a number of different communities. And after the Supreme Court affirmative action case from last year, which focused only on higher education, number one, we see a series of lawsuits targeting a variety of different organizations in the corporate space, so not sticking to higher education. And we also see, in addition to those lawsuits, a lot of state legislative action, state attorney generals, you know, threatening corporations with legal action, et cetera, right? So we see a full environmental shift, you know, after this Supreme Court case. And so Fearless Fund, you know, is a group that was sued. They were sued by the organization run by Edward Blum. Edward Blum is a litigant whose purpose is to file lawsuits that essentially dismantle affirmative action in its entirety, DEI, et cetera. So they were sued. Their case was in a district court. That court found that, you know, in favor of them, their grant program could continue. So Edward Blum's group filed an appeal in the 11th Circuit. The 11th Circuit covers Florida, Georgia, and Alabama, and they granted a preliminary injunction. So it meant that the Fearless Fund grant program immediately had to stop while they considered other elements of the case. So this case was filed in August of last year. June, so I know a lot of us have been, you know, just sitting with the decision that came out in June, but the 11th Circuit essentially doubled down in continuing to block the Fearless Fund grant program. And so now the case has to go back to the district court for a fuller examination of the facts. And so I think what's most alarming about this case is, you know, as we saw with the Supreme Court affirmative action case, like just the ramifications and fear that it's inspiring around the remedies and the work that we can do to advance, you know, racial and economic justice. So that's the first thing. The second thing is in this case, there was a law, the Section 1981 of the Civil Rights Act of 1866. And that law was passed after the Civil War, after, you know, Blacks who were enslaved had been freed, just in the recognition that, you know, freedom from being enslaved didn't guarantee any other rights. And so this law guaranteed the opportunity to enter contracts free from discrimination. And so, you know, we think about a law that was designed to provide a remedy to Black people to ensure their economic empowerment was used, you know, more than 100 years later to attack groups that are seeking to advance racial and economic justice and provide remedies, given, you know, that our society is so inequitable. And so I think that's just another element, you know, because it speaks to how we're able to remedy ongoing racial and economic injustice. And so groups, organizations are having to contend with the work that we do and, you know, make decisions on, is this still work we can continue to do given how the law is changing? But even in areas where the law hasn't changed and we don't need to yield or concede anything, the threat of a lawsuit or any of those kinds of threats, you know, are enough to stop us in our tracks and, you know, prevent us from taking the risk of moving forward or being pointed about the communities that we serve and the kind of work that we're going to do. So that was a little bit of a longer version of, you know, what's at stake with Fearless Fund, but that is essentially what is happening. And not only that, the lawsuits are continuing. And so now we're actually in this, you know, battle, this push and pull about, you know, where we're going to be, who we're going to be as a society that still is very much inequitable.
I think what's been terrifying for me, and I think for a lot of people in the sector, is this is our work. So many of our organizations explicitly states, we are supporting certain groups of individuals who are experiencing injustice and inequity, and so this presents an existential threat to many of our missions in some ways, right? So I think I can be very like empathetic with everyone who is feeling a bit fearful. And it seems like these lawsuits are not just targeting organizations now; they have been targeting individuals as well. I've been reading up on the lawsuits against, uh, heads of colleges, universities, women of color,
Hmm.
those who are advancing DEI and trying to get them fired, and so on,
Yep. Yep.
and accusing them of plagiarism or whatever, and using whatever ridiculous arguments, to really destroy their careers. So this is really scary. How are you? Yeah, how are you taking all of this, Jennifer?
Well, it is very scary. And for me and for Common Future, one of the things that we're doing is really just keeping an eye on the variety of things that are happening, because as we've talked about, it's not just the lawsuits, right? It's plagiarism as the, new code word for how we can, you know, not only take someone down, but really tap into underlying stereotypes around merits and deservedness. Who should be in these roles, who should be in these positions. Are you qualified? Are you just a DEI hire? Of course you are. And on top of that, you've plagiarized, right? So it's really deep. In addition to that, we've seen, made up investigations. There's actually a judge in the North Carolina Supreme Court who was investigated after she, shared sentiments that, the court wasn't diverse enough. And a Black woman. There's a variety of these things that are happening. So it's not that the fears we have, of taking risks are unfounded. So I think for us at Common Future, like I said, it's just about the first step is really being informed and really understanding what's happening, because the more pointed we are about the facts that are happening, the more pointed and specific we can be in how we think about a response. So we're also starting to talk to other groups about what they're experiencing, and gaining insights from how this is manifesting for different groups of people. For some, it's, maybe in conversation with funders that are asking them to be more subtle. Maybe for others, it's doubling down and describing who is served and the work that is done, and being clear about what the law says, but also what it doesn't say, and, willing to take the risk based on, the contours of the law. The other thing I'll mention, just even going back to Fearless Fund, there was a similar case where a group called Hello Alice was sued in a district court in Ohio. And Hello Alice was providing grants to Black entrepreneurs. And the judge in that case, said the group that sued them didn't have any standing, threw the case out, right? So we are hedging bets in some ways. It's not necessarily that it's a guarantee. These risks that we take will go in a negative direction. We also have some wins too, so it's important to remember that and bring that fuller context into what's happening, even though it can very well feel scary, especially for communities that are overly scrutinized and overly penalized, even when they're doing the same things, right? I say that as a Black woman who's very familiar, with those elements as well. So I think for us, it's just there's a piece that's taking it day by day to understand what's happening, understanding how it's unfolding, knowing what the risks are, and they're real, but also knowing what the wins are too, and knowing where we actually have some flexibility.
I really appreciate that framing regarding the wins, because we have been trained to mainly focus on the negative things that have been happening, and our minds are so fixated on the potential risks that we don't think about the rewards, or or the things that have been going pretty well.
Mhm.
For example, I think about like Alex Jones getting sued for all the defamation that regarding the Sandy Hook's massacre, when he was going on his show and just talking about how it's all a hoax, that all these kids were killed and parents were making stuff up. They were getting death threats and stuff, and he got sued, and now it owes millions of dollars.
Yeah.
And I think that is great, and we should be doing more of that. Like, why are we not doing this? Why are funders on our side not supporting more of these lawsuits, like fighting back against many of these like horrible people here? What is going on?
Yeah, yeah. It's, I know the law can feel scary, especially if you're not a lawyer, because it's been used as a tool of injustice. And when the narrative that you hear is around all these losses, it's essentially doubling down on that concept of what the law is for. But I would say that the law is actually a neutral tool, and it's not inevitable that it can only be used for harm, right? It has been used for many good things and can be, and actually some of the backlash is a response to the progress that's made with legal and political tools. So I would just name that first and foremost. And that's where it is helpful to understand what the wins are there, right? Like, so for all these lawsuits that are happening, not all of them are, getting negative wins, right? And when you think about strategic litigation, for example, one of the things you're doing is looking at the pros and cons of moving forward. Maybe it's a matter of time. Maybe we don't do this case now. We wait for a few years. When the conditions have changed or the Overton window is a little bit different. So there are always strategic decisions that go into the law as a tool, and it won't inevitably lead to harm, but it one of the things that needs to happen is people need to realize this, right? And we need to rethink how we respond to the law. Part of that comes from being informed, like I mentioned. Some of it comes from talking to lawyers, but not always, because lawyers do tend to be risk averse. And some of their purpose is really avoiding the risk, avoiding the lawsuit, like I mentioned earlier. So there's also that reframe with lawyers themselves. And actually, there was a podcast I was listening to where Maurice Mitchell from the Working Families Party had this very powerful line where he said, lawyers need to decouple the law from order and figure out how the law is a tool for justice and not necessarily a tool to establish order under injustice, right? So that is a call to lawyers, to rethink, our role in where society is right now and how we can help shape some of those contours. I also think, because this has come up in organizations I've been in, like I mentioned, it's, a lawsuit could happen, right? And so if it does, do you have the resources and tools to contend with it? It's not, we do everything to avoid it. How do we contend with it? Because it could actually be the lawsuit that creates a win for so many other people. And you never would have known that if, you had only been afraid and tried to avoid it. So, the resources include access to lawyers. For many of us, that means pro bono, but there are a number of great organizations that are nonprofits that offer pro bono services, or they partner with law firms that offer pro bono services. It's a matter of like our insurance policies as well. So it's really thinking about how we stack and set those resources up so that we have the protection that we need. But that enables us to still continue forward with our work and not always have to retreat and yield where we don't. And I think that applies not only to us in the sector, but also to philanthropy. They have great resources, to have the best and brightest legal minds, whether they're general counsels directly in-house or whether other resources that they're seeking. I understand that litigation is costly and timely and or time consuming. So that is definitely a factor, but we have to, I think that's the point. The exercise is to understand and weigh the different risks and use that to help make a determination of how we move forward. And if we don't realize that, we are not going to be able to do the work that we set out to do. I imagine we're all here for a purpose. We're here because we are passionate about this work. For many of us, it's not just, a job that we show up to. It's our lives, right? Like I have a stake as a Black woman in advancing racial and economic justice. That's the world that I want my sons to grow up in, to inherit, right? And so, for me, it means I have to not just show up and do a job, but I have to think about, how in, my own way, in my own lane, in my organization, I am, being a part of these solutions.
I appreciate what you said about how, in some ways, like all these lawsuits, it kind of they indicate that what we're doing has been working, right? Like this is what like if they weren't working, I mean, for all the criticisms of DEI, and there's lots of challenges,
Mhm.
and I point out lots of them, you point out them as well in our sector. It seems that the focus on DEI has been leading to some really awesome stuff, and this is why there's been
Mm.
so much pushback recently against it because people are afraid of what's actually been happening,
Yep.
right? So that is kind of a hopeful framing that it's because what we're doing is working that
Mhm.
is causing a lot of these lawsuits and things. And so maybe the response isn't for us to like back away from it, but to do more of it as
Yes.
a sector.
Yes. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, it's and if you think about it, that is part of the work. That is how we advance our vision and mission. It gets at the core of why we exist as a sector and what we're here to do. And so it is to continue to think about the variety of wins, right? And they don't always feel all the same. Sometimes they're smaller wins. Sometimes they are the major wins, right? Like that make the headlines or lead to a monumental shift. But there's a lot of everyday wins too. Fearless Fund got a lot of headlines and attention. And then we also had this win with Hello Alice, for example. Or there have been other cases targeting DEI, for example, that other courts have tossed out. So we have to understand the fuller picture of what we are contending with. But that's exactly right. Like progressive movements have had wins. Not that they've all been perfect, but that is the tapestry that we are weaving. That is the work that we are doing. And that is the legacy that we are creating, right? For future generations to be able to pick up the mantle and carry forward to, really continue to move us to those ideals of a just society.
Let's move out broader because it seems like this is something the Fearless Fund is one thing and a pretty big thing for us to think about. But our sector has always been dealing with when do we speak up? What do we say? Do we lose donors? Do we lose funders? I think about organizations in the past, for example, that were getting into trouble for supporting Black Lives Matter, for example, or supporting defund the police.
Mhm.
Right now, there's been organizations being punished for speaking up against the genocide of Palestinians and speaking up against Israel's actions. I have been targeted. I've lost keynotes. I've been dealing with a whole bunch of angry people online and in real life because and I know organizations have lost funding. I know funders have punished organizations for supporting Palestine and so on. So this is always on our minds, right?
Mhm.
Just
Mhm.
when do we take risks? What happens when we speak up? What do you say to folks when they're in this space where they have to think about what stance do they take? Should they even take a public stance on certain things?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I really appreciate you naming that because at the end of the day, there are risks and, they vary in, how bad they are, right? Like we know the lawsuits, the rollback of rights, the things that you just described, the loss of funding, the loss of speaking opportunities. I mentioned investigations. Sometimes they're even internal staff, in culture challenges, negative press, detraction from the work, burnout. I mean, the list can go on. And I actually know of some people whose physical safety has been threatened or they've been stalked, right? So I want to be very clear that there are actual risks. And so I think what is important to remember is that the risk profile is going to vary across organizations, across individuals, right? Depending on the different things you're doing. And so you have to really think about how you contend with that. So I think the first thing is understanding, like, what are the variety of risks we face? Like, what are all the things we're speaking to? Maybe because I'm speaking about or doing work on this thing, it feels too risky to also speak about this thing. And I know there's other actors in the sector that are doing that, right? Or, maybe this is going to invite a physical risk to myself and I have to think about my family. So I think individuals, the point of this is that individuals actually undergo that exercise of mapping it out, being clear, right? Because there's even ways that leaders might be targeted. And I can't just think about myself. I have to think about like my fuller organization and how other people are impacted. If, I say this thing and we lose this funding, maybe it's the principle of the thing and we have to lose that funding and we have to do the contingency planning for how we'll continue our programs or, what other funders might support us in that gap. But maybe it's that funding is so critical because we're talking about jobs, right? And so by undergoing that exercise, what we're starting to do is create a culture of risk management. So there are no guarantees. We cannot avoid risk. And many of us are even privileged to not have to take certain risks, right? Many of us do not live in precarious conditions where our lives are on the line every day. And so we have the opportunity to really just think about how we build that culture and that practice. Those are muscles that need to develop. They're underdeveloped in our sector. And so we develop those muscles by the awareness, by, getting the information that we need to appropriately weigh the risks. That can mean, you're using different tools to do risk assessments. It can mean you're having conversations with attorneys and other decision makers, in your organization. And so I think once we start to do those things, we can actually recognize when something is actually a risk or not. Am I simply uncomfortable or is this detrimental, right? And there's a difference between the two. And then we can better decide what are the risks we actually can or cannot afford to take because of the stakes that come with them. So I think that's how I think, about these things. This is how, I talk to, other peers and other colleagues that I work with, and we actually, on our operations team have some folks working on like a safety and security plan. We're thinking about the upcoming election, right? And fun fact, my third day at Common Future was the day of the insurrection at the Capitol. So I didn't even have a moment to weigh and think about risks, but my actions fell to the skills and experiences that I already had to draw from. So as we develop these muscles, we're better able to weigh the risks and also able to respond to crises that you can't really always plan for. So I think that is the work and that is the exercise. And it also better equips us to show up in the work that we're here to do, right? Like the various things that we're working on across the sector, having those muscles developed, enables our longevity, our sustainability, because we're better able to contend with those things. We're more prepared. And that helps us. I mentioned at the beginning, I'm a Virgo, so I have a plan B. I have a plan C. And then if plan C falls through, I probably have elements that I could pull from plan A. So it's really just about getting in that mindset first and foremost, and starting with that awareness.
Let's talk about some of the assumptions that we make, because I feel like a lot of these risks that we think about are based on the assumptions that may not be real. For
Mhm.
example, we think that if we make a stance in support of something, that people might stop being donors, for example,
Mhm. Mhm.
right? If we say something that donors don't like, they might they might leave.
Mhm.
And I think about maybe that's not always true. I think about sometimes donors really it might be the opposite. Maybe they really want us.
Mhm.
I think about an organization in Seattle, for example, that one of my friends led, and they decided that they were going to support defund the police, and they sent out an email to all their donors saying that we are supporting defunding the police, and this is what we condemn the killing of George Floyd by the police, etc. And they knew that when they put this out, they were going to lose some funders,
Mhm.
and they did it anyways. And what they discovered was that, yeah, they lost a few donors, but they gained like 5 more new
Mhm.
donors
Right.
for every donor that they lost, because people really appreciated that they align with their values and they were sticking up to it. And I think maybe for us, we need to start thinking of what are these assumptions that we're making.
Mhm.
One assumption is that donors can't handle this, and we're treating them like babies who can't handle a difficult conversation or a difficult principle stand. And another assumption is that if they don't like things, they will just leave.
Mhm.
And those assumptions are not always true. What are some other assumptions that you think about, or regarding risks?
Yeah, I think the funder one is a big one. And I think it's true that, you might be surprised, and, either the funders that you have support what you're saying or doing. You gain new funders. And I think there's also the other nuance that I talk about with folks too, is that within funding institutions, there's a range of people, right? And so there's often, program officers, not always, but sometimes, who are also making the case too, right? And so even just thinking about the nuance of who your supporters are within a single institution, and, just thinking about those kinds of opportunities. I think the other one, the other big one that I hear, is around our ability to do advocacy. That
Mm.
one is like the huge, like, oh, IRS rules, we can't do advocacy, so I can't say the thing, I'm not going to say the thing. And it's another area where we're often not informed about, what's permissible or not. I was actually recently in a conversation where I think Project 2025 came up, and Project 2025, it's this long document from conservatives around the things that they're planning, should the White House turn over to Trump. And there was a question around, like, oh, is this 501c4 territory? And that's a legitimate question, because, we have fears around, losing our tax exempt status, which is, it enables us to do our work. And, the reality is, like, there's very precise things that are meant when you think about these rules. So, what we're talking about are things that are partisan, right? Supporting campaigns, supporting individuals, running for various elections, right? Simply referencing a document does not qualify as that. When you're talking about advocacy, nonprofits actually can do some levels of advocacy, and there's different rules about what that looks like. So there's a call for us to really be informed about what those rules say, what those tests are, as opposed to an immediate, oh, I got to stay away from it, I can't say the thing. Because that it also forces us into very short-term band-aid type solutions, that don't address the root causes of why our sector exists, and why we're here to do the work that we're going to do. And so I think it's just really important to understand that. So I think a lot of what I'm saying comes down to being very crisp with the information that we have. And sometimes that's hard to do. We're in an age of AI and a lot of misinformation and disinformation. And so, for me, I grew up in the 90s. So I'm like, I fall back to like my old school, investigative. Let me make sure, this information is correct. But I think the being informed and equipped with information is really important. I think the other area this comes from, it has to do with boards, right? We have boards that are not always aligned, or maybe aligned at a very surface level. And so we risk upsetting members of our boards. And that can mean different things, right? Especially for boards that provide funding or provide connections or those kinds of things. And so even if we're clear on, other institutional funders or the advocacy piece, we don't want to step on the toes of board members, right? And so I think the call there is to really think about the dynamics, continue to think about the power dynamics. And Vu, you've talked about this a lot. What does it look like for us to have the minimally viable board, right? And so that is something that Common Future, is very much explored, the maximally valuable, minimally viable board, because of these inherent power dynamics that also hinder the work that we are able to do, even if it's subconscious, right? Like it could be, as with donors, that like it's not going to be a problem for the board, but because we're afraid, and not only afraid, like sometimes the board leader dynamics are not always healthy, and they take up a lot of our time, right? Like working with the board, preparing for the board meetings. And so we are weighing those costs, but I think that's another area to be thoughtful about and think about. And I'll give one example. There is an organization, this was very public, Safe Horizon, and they had a contentious falling out with one of their board members, Linda Fairstein, who was also the prosecutor responsible, for the Central Park Five youth that were arrested and spent time in prison, based on accusations of, assault and rape of a Central Park jogger, that DNA evidence ultimately exonerated them from. And, Safe Horizon, they took the risk of being public with this and, not wanting to be aligned with such a board member. And, she ultimately resigned. There's a lot of other fallout that happened, including, a lawsuit for defamation that she recently had against Ava DuVernay, who, created a film about this case and her role in it, that was resolved. But, sometimes that's an area where we have to take the risk as well. So I think funders, boards, and our ability to do advocacy are the major areas that I tend to see.
Yeah, boards can be such a problem. And minimally viable boards, this is a concept that an organization called Creating the Future has been discussing, which is to have a board that just does the basic minimum and gets out of the way. And it could be combined with a different board of community leaders who don't really have a lot of legal responsibilities, but who can handle the values of the organization, its strategic direction, and so on. But the legal board does the very basic minimum and really doesn't do anything else. So that is an interesting idea for us to explore, because I do see a lot of boards are sort of like the most risk averse forces in our sector. And I think we need to kind of reckon with just how destructive that is. They are some of the most risk averse people, not just boards for organizations, but boards of foundations as well. And that's why we probably don't have enough funding for advocacy. We have funders preventing advocacy work from happening, and a bunch of other things. So I don't know. There seems to be a couple of things we need to discuss. One is the risk that we need to take as individuals and as organizations, and then the risks that we need to take as a sector. And
Mhm.
both of them are right now really ensconced in risk aversion,
Mhm.
and I don't think that's been very helpful. right?
Yeah. And I'm actually curious because you are someone who has been very vocal about a variety of things. You've spoken out, you've taken risks, and I'm curious, how you've come to those decisions or those points.
Oh, well, I think we have to acknowledge one is that I have a lot more privilege. I think as like a man, a cisgender man, for example, someone who has higher education, etc. There are certain privileges that I can get away with in saying things that other people, women of color, might be punished for saying. So I want to acknowledge that, and I also want to acknowledge those of us who do have the privileges should be taking more risks,
Mhm.
and that does come with some of the flack, right?
Mhm.
With taking risks. So, but I also think about like what is our point? What is my point as an individual trying to do this work? Why I got into this work in the first place, which is to try to make the world better. And if I can't really speak up on injustice, then I am not fulfilling my sort of personal mission to make the world better. And I think this is kind of where we are at as a sector too, right? Which is, what is our sector for? If we're not going to advance DEI, we get scared because some organizations are getting sued. Like, a couple of organizations are getting sued. Not even our own organization, but just the potential of us getting sued means that we're stopping doing what we as a sector are doing or as an organization. Then what is the point of our sector?
Mhm. Yep. Exactly. Exactly. That is, I mentioned how I show up to this work. So that's something that I think about it. In some ways it feels like we take a risk every day just because we are here to advance racial and economic equity, right? That that goes to the heart of some of the f- the founding components of this country as we know it, right? A country that was founded through extraction of land from indigenous people, through forced labor of Black people. I mean, so it completely goes against just some of how we were constructed, and the ideals underlining that. And so it just, in some ways, it just feels like a risk all the time, no matter what. To say that we should do something different, to say that we should have a different economy, to say that we should center, the folks that have been, most harmed by racial and economic injustice. But yet here we are.
So we're wrapping up, and I would love to hear from folks who have questions here. And I know some folks might have to hop off. So thank you for joining us. And for everyone else, we'll continue for another half an hour, and we'll answer some of the questions that you have. What what should we do to regularly activate our bravery as we determine risk and make decisions? What's your advice for people?
Yeah, that's such a good one. There's
Yeah, because we wrote it together.
That's such a good one though, because I think that is the core of what folks need to go back to. So the first is to, I think, understand that there's times where we may have a false sense of security and safety anyway, right? There are no guarantees, and sometimes it doesn't take much for society as we know it to change. And so I think it's just grappling with what our sense of safety and security even is. I think regularly regrounding in purpose and values, and going back to those driving forces are really important. And those are different for everyone. But I think that's a key piece. I think, again, as we talked about, think about not only what you could lose, but what you and others could gain, the wins that we have had. I think self-care and joy and restorative practices are really important, and being in community with other people, working towards the same things. I think it's also important to just name and to feel the fears that we have, right? Like, You know, if you're feeling afraid, you're feeling anxious, like, you know, we're so polite in the sector that we don't name those things. We don't have the skills to name those things, but they're real and they're here. So there's an element of acknowledgement and being able to let it, you know, pass and, you know, just sit with it. Um, there's actually an activity that I wanted to mention that I do with some of my colleagues when we're having to contend with something, and it's called worst case scenario. So it's when we actually take time to imagine the worst case scenario. And it's like, what is the worst thing that can happen here? Let's name it. Let's name all the bad things that can happen. Oh, how does that feel? How are you feeling sitting with that? Okay, take a breath. Now, let's think about some things that we can do. And it really gives us an opportunity to contend with something in a moment that's not a crisis, and really allows us to open up and explore the different tools and avenues that we could pursue to contend with that scenario. So that's actually just an activity I've used with a couple of different folks on different things. I think, as you mentioned, recognizing our privilege. And then there's also just recognizing the folks whose shoulders we stand on, the people who have come before us who had to do much more with less resources. You know, I have here my Fannie Lou Hamer pin. I collect pins like these because it just reminds me of folks that have come before that have, you know, just had to contend with a lot of things that I am privileged to not have to, right? Like, you know, violence, loss of employment, like all these things. And I'm very privileged that I've not had to do that. So just recalling that, I think is important, and remembering we're not alone. You know, we're in this community together, and that is a strength. And just remembering there are folks you can call on, you know, who can stand in the gap with you, if you will, and just be there with you in community with you. And we're together grappling these things. So that's the advice that I would give.
I really appreciate that. I think this worst case scenario is something that a lot of therapists recommend, right? Which is like we all have anxiety, and I think generalized anxiety has worsened a lot over the past several years, and with good reason. Everything is going to shit in some ways. It's like everything is
Yeah.
on fire, awful, and
Yeah.
so many people. I think if you weren't having anxiety, then you may need to be worried because it's normal for you not to have anxiety when everything is seems to be so terrible right now.
Right.
But I do like that exercise of thinking about the worst case scenario. What would happen? Like I think about what would happen if I get canceled because I'm speaking up for Palestine and I lose and no one wants to book me for any more keynotes. And then what would I do? And then I start thinking about, well, then I would probably need to, I don't know, open a stand at a farmer's market selling fermented vegetables or something, which sounds kind of fun. So there
That
you
doesn't
go.
sound too bad, actually.
That's right. So that's my worst case scenario is that I am selling things at the farmer's market and that's not so bad. So you know, full of probiotics, it's gonna be lacto fermented. I've been studying this just as a plan C for my Virgo moon rising or whatever. Yeah. But the other thing that I think we should remember, what you said, Jennifer, and a good reminder is that there have been people in the past, in like the civil rights movement and other movements, who have gone through significantly more
Mhm.
risks than we are experiencing. I mean, they were beaten and killed and disappeared and things, you know, not just in the United States, but all over
Yes.
the world. Like all these leaders have done some incredible things, face so many horrible odds and things, and we, I think, in some ways, owe it to them
Absolutely.
to be taking more risks because the risks that we're taking is nowhere near, I think, in some ways, as much as some of the things that they have taken on.
Absolutely agree. You know, in a way, how we honor the sacrifices that they made to create the society that we do have. And, you know, that while it has many, many problems and, you know, terrible things are happening, there are still some privileges that we have that they did not. And so we honor that sacrifice by carrying, forward and continuing, like I said earlier, to weave this tapestry together. This is unfinished work, and it will be for a long time. And this is how we do our part to prepare the future generations who will have to pick up the work. And even if we were to get to this place that we want to see, there's also the work to protect it from the snapback, right? Like that is always lurking. And so it's ongoing work. There's not there's the ideal of the destination, but it's very much an ongoing journey for all of us, and for generations to come. And so we honor our ancestors by continuing to tap in.
Right, because everything there's a lot at stake right now. And I think about, yeah, we think about the risks that we could be taking on, but what are the risks of us not taking on these risks? What does that do for our society and for our kids? I mean, you and I both have kids, and I start thinking about what would happen. What is the society that they're going to grow up in if we don't take these risks for them?
Yeah. And that
So
feels so much scarier for me.
I think so. So I agree. Um, I would love to hear just from anyone here in the audience. That's the main discussion that Jennifer and I know we can go on forever here, but for the next 20 minutes or so, we just love to hear from you and any questions that you have regarding anything that we've discussed. Yeah. Okay. In the Q&A, okay, let me see. Here's one. To what extent do you think we can look forward to a generational shift here? I find that younger grant making staff are very eager to take risks, but don't have the authority, even when they do have the experience because of ageism and so on. Will their affinity for risks duel with time spent in the sector? How can we swoop in and preserve and encourage their brave ideas?
Ooh, that's a really good one. I will say, I feel like, youth and younger generations, in movements I've seen, have always, collectively speaking, had that passion and that fire, right? And we've seen that play out in the different movements, right? Like we saw how that took hold in the civil rights movement when groups like SNCC and others wanted to think about the different strategies to employ. I think what's important is, the continued mentorship, and for the person asking this question, like, continue to encourage those folks. And, the reality is we don't always all have the same power in the organizations that we're in terms of decision making, but we do have some power, right? And within the power that you have, how can you continue to voice and say and do what needs to be said? And how can those of us who do have power uplift that and give appropriate credit, but just uplift those messages, and really point others in the direction of these generations that have something important to say. And how do we contend with power dynamics? How do we mentor and encourage and stand with and amplify some of the things that are being said? And how do we think about continued leadership development and this concept of organizations being leaderful, and that not being contingent on position or title, right? And so how might these generations be leaders in their own right with the power, decision-making power that they do have? So those are some of the things that I would think about, as I work with different generations and think about the collective, work that we have to do to create a just society.
Yeah, I think right now might be a really good time to think about all this stuff. I think in the past we've always were warning people that like boomers are going to retire and there's going to be a leadership gap. And I'm starting to feel like it's starting to happen now.
Mhm.
And maybe some of that is because people are aging out and they're thinking about retirement, but also because people are getting very exhausted.
Mhm.
and even younger leaders are getting tired, and we're having this sort of gap in people wanting to become leaders of nonprofits and so on. And so all the younger folks who are in the audience who are thinking about like how do we actually effect change and get the authority? Well, now might be a really good time to start strategizing about what would you do if you are in leadership position.
Yeah.
But in the meanwhile, I agree with you that there is still a lot of power that younger professionals can exert.
Mhm.
And I do think that we need to be a little bit more, we need to be better at organizing.
Yes.
The systems kind of beat us down so that we're always just thinking about how do we do things alone when just the best and most effective actions is often to organize movements and to mobilize people. Um, and that's, I mean, that's what we've been doing with like crappy funding practices, calling out crappy funders and their, and that's a movement, and that's like a lot of like brilliant leaders who are anonymous actually, but they're like organizing, and that's been taking off. The community centric fundraising movement, which I've been involved with, there's just lots of chapters across different cities, just thinking about tackling fundraising differently. I think about trust based philanthropy and that sort of movement to really change and shift power in philanthropy, and that has been really cool. So I think about like we need to organize better. Like
Mm.
leading from the middle, you may not have all the authority, but I think by organizing, you can really get a lot of stuff happening.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think the organizing and continuing to experiment with and rethink, our how our organizations are structured. I know at Common Future, we spend a lot of time thinking about that. We've moved to three co-CEOs, like I mentioned, and we have a 4-day work week. We're just really trying to do a lot of the things that are not necessarily the norm in our sector. And part of it is to shift the power dynamics that we're so used to, and shift how we treat our people, right? And so I think those are important things, the movement building and also re-examining our structures. That could be like a whole other webinar too.
All right, we have a few more questions. Um, if you are, how are you thinking about the seeming strategy that groups like American Alliance for Equal Rights, Do No Harm, and others want, all press, good or bad? So one justified strategy is to assiduously avoiding anything that would create headlines. It makes it harder to organize in our experience. Um, I'm not so familiar with all the groups that are out there doing all of this thing, but I do agree that we are very avoidant of any sort of bad press at all, right? Anything that creates any sort of bad press about anything, we just don't want to be in the limelight at all. And I think this has really affected our ability to do our work.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, you know, some of us aren't necessarily in the headline because, we're the opponent to some of these groups, right? Like Fearless Fund. They didn't ask for this, but they are in the limelight. And there are many others that are in the limelight as well, just as a result of this. So I think what I would think about here is like there's almost like a tiered approach where it makes sense for some of us to be in the limelight because that's what brings the attention. And for others, we don't all have to be, and that maybe enables us to do some of our work and to not have that other distraction. I think the other thing is, it's also challenging to keep up with all the things that are continuing to happen because it seems like something is happening every day. So I think there's also like just an opportunity for us to better contend with the variety of things and understand the different headlines so that we're again more equipped with information if and when we're in that position, and otherwise just continuing to march forward.
Okay, another question. Could someone speak to HR 6408, which suspends the tax exempt status of a terrorist supporting organization? I am fearful of how this will be exercised in a politically charged environment around Palestine. How is the sector responding?
So that one I'm actually not as familiar with, and I don't know if the sector is responding. I personally haven't heard anything specific about it, so that could just be a gap. I'm sure that there are some legal groups probably thinking about that, especially for and with organizations that work directly, in impacted communities. But I haven't heard of anything broader, and I'm not as familiar.
Well, we can talk about it in the general sense. There's going to be these types of laws that are marking people as terrorists. I mean, this has happened like for months now. Like Congress would pass a law saying that any sort of criticism of Israel is considered anti-Semitic. Any criticism of Zionism is considered anti-Semitic. I wouldn't be surprised if this bill is like calling anyone a terrorist who supports Palestine or who criticizes Israel. Um, but I think this is kind of where we're at. If we don't fight back, if we don't take the risks in fighting back, is that we have more and more of these ridiculous laws, many of which won't actually hold up in court, right? But they're being weaponized anyways, just to scare us.
Mhm.
And that's kind of where we're at, like this assumption that these laws are actually valid somehow, that we
Mhm.
should be okay with trying to conform to them instead of going, this is a ridiculous law. We're just not going to bother with this law. And then funders should be like, yeah, we're going to support, we're going to have a legal defense fund to anyone who's going to be labeled a terrorist because of this. Like, I would like for us to start mobilizing around that too, which is to get our funders to start providing more support for advocacy, for more legal defenses, for ridiculousness like here, weaponized laws and stuff like this.
Yeah, I think the legal defense is important, and I know, for example, with groups like Fearless Fund, organizations like Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, NAACP, LDF, and then the ACLU on a broad variety of issue areas are precisely doing that kind of work. And so how do our organizations connect with them and understand the resources available, I think is important. I also think the narrative strategy, right? Like this isn't the first time we're seeing this. How far back in history do we need to go? Like when we think about, Nelson Mandela, when we think about MLK, when we think about COINTELPRO, like, all these leaders and folks, fighting for different rights and how they were labeled or how, the narrative about them, was painted. And so I think we have some lessons that can be instructive. And, I think the narrative is a key component of, how we combat that.
I think it's a good reminder that Nelson Mandela was labeled a terrorist by the US government, I believe. Yeah, he was a terrorist for, yeah. So it's all right. Let's move on to the next question before we get delve deeper into that. Do you have guidance for how nonprofits can be less risk averse when it comes to staff who are harming their employees, especially with racism? If someone is doing good work individually and also using power over their employees to cause harm, how can we face the risk of losing key senior staff when we hold them accountable for their behavior?
Yeah, so definitely have seen that too. This sentiment where folks that are seen as doing good work or bringing in funding or doing certain things that an organization finds valuable are given a pass on other behavior that is inappropriate. And so there's two things. I think the first is really being clear about your accountability structure, what behavior is acceptable or not, right? Like formal, informal, what are you okay with and what are you not? Because if you ultimately say something is not acceptable and you accept it, that's a culture and a norm that you're creating, and people will operate and organize themselves around that. And it will only get worse. It doesn't get better if you, close your eyes to it. So I think there's that piece. The other thing is, it comes down to, you may have to take some of those more drastic actions where someone does leave or they're not aligned with the accountability that the organization requires. And so I think in those situations, it's recognizing that there's a broader field of professionals and people who will be aligned, and not only aligned and doing the work and pushing it forward, but who will be accountable to what the organization requires. And, so many organizations sacrifice, folks who are from communities that have already been so harmed, right? Sacrificing Black women, sacrificing, folks that are LGBTQ plus, like all these different communities. So I think we have to be clear around what our accountability is, and really stick to that. And yeah, there could be some ramifications of that, but at the end of the day, it is moving you into greater alignment with your values and purpose as an organization, I would say.
Another question, how do we cultivate funders who don't just want to write a check, but actually want to engage in this difficult emotional work and be accountable along with us in this journey? Well, I would say, like, we need to present what we want, right? I think in some ways we just conform to all these unrealistic expectations instead of, again, mobilizing and making it known. I think we lie to our funders a lot. We lie by omission. We lie just outright about all the challenges that we're facing and the needs that we want to address. I think about the organizations in Washington State, who got together and wrote an open letter to all the funders in the area. And 180 EDs signed this letter saying we need more funding. It needs to be going to Black and Brown community-led organizations. It needs to be 5 years in general operating funds, and you need to sign a pledge saying that you're going to do this. And I would like for us to do more of that. So funders can't really be effective partners if we don't tell them what we need.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah. And I think to that exact point, it helps when we're in community and strengthened in numbers, right? Because it you know removes some of the individual risk that we might face in flipping a power dynamic. That's essentially what we're talking about. And so that's certainly one piece. I think another piece is in being in relationship too. And I know it's not always possible with every single funder. Some of the relationships do feel more transactional, but there are some where we can really be in great relationship and have these kinds of conversations and have them be advocates in a sense, who not only uplift these ideas around what the need is within their own institutions, but even in how they speak amongst their own peers. And we have seen some examples of this. There are some shifts in philanthropy that's happening. I was really pleasantly surprised, today when I saw this affirmation from MacArthur Foundation doubling down in their racial justice commitment, and even saying, like, basically, like, we're not scared of the 11th Circuit opinion, on Fearless Fund. Like, this is, what we're doing is legal. And it means we're, committing to our racial justice work, right? So there are some out there, and how can we be in relationship as they work among their peers to move towards the things that we want to.
Okay, a couple more questions. And I think we can combine them. One is, what are your thoughts about DI orgs specifically shifting their language in hopes that their actual work of what they do behind closed door can and will continue, but just under a different name? Like, let's not call it DEI, we'll call it something else. And then another question, a related question, which is, DI efforts are under pretty violent attack, as we've discussed. What's the value of renaming these efforts? Foundational equity work also looks like leadership, coaching development, changing HR systems within org, creating strong mentor programs rooted in anti-racist practice, etc., to create a smoother path with boards and less external risk versus the importance of naming efforts as related to goals around diversity and inclusion outright publicly. I have some thoughts, but and you may not agree, but like, I think we just need to like stop trying to change what we do so that other people who are fragile snowflakes who want to sue everyone can just be more comfortable with it. Like, I think we do enough of that in the sector.
Yeah.
And it's about time that we just take a stand saying, this is what we're about. We're about justice. We're about equity. We're about anti-racism. And we're not going to back down. And so I don't know what, for me, like, we need to stop yielding to people and calling it new things so that they can be better able to take it and so on.
Yeah, I agree. I think that, it's muting and eliminating our ability to be pointed about the work that we're doing and to be clear about who we're serving. So I think these are certainly decision points that organizations are grappling with. And this is where all these tools in this conversation today comes in. And I hope organizations will go back and, if they have started to do those things, rethink what they're doing. On the other hand, I know that there are specific entities that have had to do this because of state laws that have come down, right? And so I think that's a different kind of scenario. And I want to recognize that too. It's not that they're just readily and willingly, changing it, but they have specific, whether it's state legislation, state executive orders, local executive orders. We've seen that sweep the South, Alabama, Florida, Texas, states like that. And so for them, there's a question of, okay, we have these specific orders, how can we continue this work? And the tools that we have available in this setting are renaming things, right? And so I think I would look at that maybe a little bit differently. And maybe there are some, right? Like, we can talk about civil disobedience, right? That's a strategy we've seen employed in other movements. But I think groups are contending with different things that are driving what we're doing. I would say at the end of the day, if the law or regulatory structure hasn't changed, are you unnecessarily yielding and conceding where you don't have to versus instances where you actually have to, because you're losing you actually are losing specific funding, and there is another status quo that is maintained because of that. And so it's like, how do we operate within the system and also think outside of the system? Always the both and of having to contend with that.
Whew, this is a lot. Last question, which we can touch briefly on, which is, what are some activities, board, team building events to cultivate brave conversations between staff and board? I think we just need to have these conversations consistently, every single board meeting. Like, I think about that MacArthur letter that came out. Like, that would be great to bring up to your board and saying, look, this is what some of our funders, what does that mean for us? How do we be just as brave? How do we do this? And just make this as part of the culture of bravery, is to bring up brave things that other organizations are doing and have that be inspiring to you and your board and to discuss, like, what are we willing, and the activities that you brought up, Jennifer, of the risk assessment and so on, and the worst case scenarios, like, bring those up to your board and have conversations around that. We can wrap it up. I would say the thing that I really appreciate from this conversation with you, Jennifer, first of all, thank you so much for your time and your expertise in legal and in leadership and other places. I appreciate just the hope that you brought, which is that, yeah, what we're doing is working. Like, our sector is doing some kick-ass stuff, fighting injustice, and that's why we're getting sued. And right, so the result is for us to not like back away, but to keep doing more of what we've been doing, because it is working.
Yes, that's exactly right. There's this sentiment from Brian Stevenson of Equal Justice Initiative. Hope is an enemy of injustice. And so how do we continue to uplift, those feelings of hope? Because that ultimately is what helps us drive forward. So just appreciate ending on that sentiment.
Thank you so much, everyone. I hope you have a great rest of the week and keep on causing good trouble, like John Lewis said. So I
Yeah.
appreciate you all.
Thanks, everyone.